All right, so in this tutorial, we're going to show you how to take a site and import it into Sketchup, and then export that site into Rhino, where you can create contours from it and create a topography map. So in SketchUp, when you open this, if you right-click, if you don't see location, make sure to select that in the toolbars here, and then this will show up. So you're going to click Add More Imagery, and you're going to find your site. So zoom in on the region that you're interested in, click on Select Region, and this will allow you to crop a portion of the site that you want to import. So you're going to grab maybe this much context. You're limited in how much you can actually import. So we're going to keep this limited. I'm going to leave this to high resolution. And you can choose, do you want to import an image that'll show up as a street map or as a satellite? I think we're going to use satellite here. I'm just going to hit import. So it's downloading the 3D topographical mesh from Google Earth, or Bing in this case. And you can see when you zoom in that there's actual texture to this. Not extremely accurate as far as topography, right? That's obviously a flat street, but it's enough to give you kind of an understanding of the terrain, and gives you enough that you can start slicing this in Rhino. So, what I would do is model the street, model the roads that obviously are flat, but use the topography that you import from this. Okay, so from that, it comes in locked. It's in a red box here. You can right-click and unlock that. If you double-click, it was in a group, so you can double-click and access this. You can just export this. So if I go File, Export, I can export this as a 3D model. Couple different file types. I could even save this just as a SketchUp file. So if I just save it as a SketchUp file. Call it site. And then opening up Rhino, I can import SketchUp files into Rhino just in the standard SketchUp format. Use the large objects template. And I can type import. I'm going to import that SketchUp file. It's going to import faces as a mesh. It brings in the person, which we don't need. And if I turn on shaded, you'll see it as kind of a gray mesh. It's clearly getting this texture map wrong, which is kind of interesting. So I'm going to delete that. Yeah, wrong texture coming in, but it's interesting also to see that this, there's a couple planes here. So looking at the way Rhino sees the material, there's different ways that it's going to map that texture onto the geometry. So if we go under texture mapping, we can look at some other different texture map things. We can say apply planar mapping, in which case we click on one corner of the plane and the other, and it's going to map it based on the plane. But again, referring back to SketchUp here, we know that this is wrong, right? We want to see the river. This whole thing should be part of it. So somehow the texture didn't scale properly. So we want to look at this and say custom mapping, or let's see. There's different ways that that image can map on the actual surface. Yeah, it's struggling there. But anyway, let's just take this as a mesh for now. We have the actual mesh geometry. We want to grab contour lines out of this, similar to some of the topography lines that we saw in lecture. So what we want to do is do a contour. So I'm going to do this on the next layer here in red. And if you type contour, select objects, I'm going to select the mesh, hit enter, and I'm going to give it a base point. So find the lowest point on here. You can also just type 0 if I want it to start at the origin. And then it's asking for the direction of the perpendicular contours. So I can go into one of my other views, for example, front, do this, clicking up, and then it's going to ask for the distance between contours. I'm in feet, so we'll say every 1 foot, enter, and you'll see it generate contour lines based on this mesh. So it's slicing the mesh at each of those levels. So I can turn off that mesh and you'll see that there are contour lines generated from that. Okay, so again, these are every 1 foot. Often contour lines in a site plan will be maybe every 10 feet. So there's ways that you can do that. So you can say, okay, that's 1, and then count 10. Maybe those all get a different layer. So I'm going to right click on this, say change object layer. So maybe you count every 10 and do that. Or maybe you can just hit the contour button again, or command again, and tell it every 10 feet to generate those. Because it's nice to have different scales. Often when you're looking at a topography map, you'll have maybe 10 feet, it has a heavier line weight, and every maybe 5 feet has a lighter line weight. So you can kind of get an understanding of the scale of this. You're also noticing some triangulation in this, right? You can see the triangles, and that's just because the mesh that we were contouring wasn't very smooth to begin with. So you're getting these kind of panels in it, which aren't accurate to what you would see on the site. So there's ways that we can increase the mesh triangles and kind of smooth this out so that you don't get those kind of triangulation in the geometry. So let's take a look at that and turn off those other layers. So again, you can see that this is triangulated, and it's not the most dense mesh. So under mesh tools, there's a few things that we could do. There's smooth, where you can select a mesh, type smooth, and you can tell it kind of the number of steps that you want it to take, number of smoothing steps. By increasing this, it's actually going to kind of flatten and reduce the geometry, which we don't want to do. We don't want to flatten it. Right, so you can play with that to smoothen the geometry. I don't want to really do that. I want to increase the number of mesh triangles in this. So I can select this there's a couple things. So under sub D, there's requad mesh or remesh. So I can select this and I can tell it the number of mesh triangles that I want it to generate. So if the target count is 2000, maybe we up this to, it's hard to know how many mesh triangles there, we can find out, I guess. We can select this. This says 42 meshes, so this is, so it's breaking these up. If I type explode, or ungroup, yeah, you can see that these are grouped into panels. And that may have been also why this, the texture didn't come in properly. It's probably reading just one of these panels and trying to apply it to the whole thing. But if I were to select this, type explode, maybe ungroup, then explode. Yeah, it's not letting me break that up into individual meshes. But I can select this whole thing, type join. So now it's just one mesh. And if I want to requad this, let's just see what happens. I'm going to leave this at 2000 quads and hit OK. So it's creating rectangles or squares instead of triangles. And that's also kind of a gross approximation of this. We can increase that number. So requad mesh, I'm going to set this to 6000. Okay, maybe a little better, but let's keep increasing this. I'm going to set this to 12,000. It's taking a minute to think about it, but it's becoming more and more smooth. So getting us closer to what we're looking for. Let's try this again. I'm going to say 24,000. It'll take a second, but all right, so it did a decent job of that, and you can see the difference between the original and the new mesh that we created, so a lot smoother. So once we contour this, it'll be a little bit better. So I'm going to put it on this layer. So with it selected, I right click on the layer and say change object layer, and I'm going to go into this layer, make this red, and I'm going to hide this other stuff. So we have our new mesh, and again, it's going to preserve the geometry. It didn't really flatten anything. It's just creating a more smooth version of that using this quad remesh tool, and it's under sub D tools. Okay, so with that, I can then go to contour, and it's asking for the base point. I'm going to hit 0, so it finds the origin. Draw a line perpendicular, double click. I'm going to go into front view, click up. It's just looking for a direction here. So I'm going to click, and then it's asking for the distance. This time I'll say 5 feet. And you can see the difference between those two drawings that it generated. All right, so this is a little bit more smooth, a little bit more accurate to what we're looking at. And obviously with this, we're not getting the individual contours between these. So, you know, maybe this distance is good here, but we're not really seeing much change here. So I'll create a new set of contours. We'll make these blue, and turning this layer back on, select this contour, 0, direction, oops, select contour, 0, up, and I'm going to set the distance to 1, so 1 foot. So now you're seeing the same geometry, contouring it at every 1 foot, and it's still, you know, a little bit panelized, but much better resolution contour. Okay, so going into top view, you can see that. And I suppose if you wanted to play around with the texture mapping, you could still find a way to get that to map properly onto that geometry. There's other ways to do that. You could, maybe instead of exporting it as a Sketchup file, if we export this as a DWG, we can try that. So file, export. If that's a DWG, there's other file types that we can experiment with. FBX often handles texture well, so I'm going to say, call this site under documents. I'll save this to desktop. I'm going to export this as an FBX and see how that differs when we import it. So going into top view, if I type import, I'm going to change this to all supported types, FBX. So it's going to come in like that. So it comes in mapped slightly different here. So I'm going to rotate that -90. That's upside down. So I'm going to rotate this 180 using the gumball. And let's turn on rendered view, and that looks like it's mapped correctly. So importing it as an FBX would be the way to go when you're importing into Rhino and you want to maintain the texture. FBX does a good job of that. All right, so everything else applies. So I would select this whole mesh, join. The other thing I'm noticing too is the scale difference. So make sure the scale is correct when you're modeling. This is in inches, so if I type units, actually I'm in feet, so make sure your units are the same and you've taken a measurement in SketchUp, so maybe you take a distance using this tape measure tool. So if I know, for example, that from here to here is 2,324 feet and 3 inches, I can use that to scale in Rhino. So click, and then 2,324 feet. I can get that to be the right size. So it looks like the size that I first imported that from SketchUp came in at the right size, but then FBX had to be scaled properly. And it should, if we go into, let's see, that mesh. Yeah, so when we joined it together, kind of lost the mapping that texture had. So if I type join, it gets confused again. So just be aware that you're going to have to manipulate the texture when you're importing a textured mesh from SketchUp.